Welcome to this RSAA panel discussion, the second in our series, Power, Legitimacy and Influence, the Future of Asia. The series is running over the course of 2 years, exploring 6 long-standing regimes in Asia that have had and continue to have a huge influence outside their own borders, shaping the region and its trajectory. We began the series in March with a panel discussion focused on President Erdogan and Turkey's democratic backsliding, and next year we will look at India, North Korea, China, and Saudi Arabia. But today we turn our attention to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran has had a bruising year with devastating attacks on its proxies across the Middle East, the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, and in June, a brief but punishing 12-day war with Israel, which saw surprise assassinations of some of Iran's military, political, and scientific leadership, significant bombing of key military, energy, and government sites, and US bombing of 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. Last month, sweeping economic and military sanctions were reimposed on Iran, arguably placing the Islamic Republic in its weakest position in a decade. Today's panel discussion will consider how the development of the Islamic Republic, its domestic politics, and the leadership of Ayatollah Khamenei have led Iran to this point, and what recent developments might mean for the future of the Islamic Republic. We have a fantastic set of panelists with us today, who will be moderated by Sir Richard Dalton. Sir Richard spent 36 years in the UK's diplomatic service, during which time he was Consul General in Jerusalem in the 90s, where he was responsible for dealings with the Palestinian Authority after the signing of the Oslo Accords. In 1999, he re-established UK diplomatic relations with Libya, becoming the first ambassador to Tripoli for 17 years. And between 2002 and 2006, he was the British ambassador to Tehran, involved in European negotiations with Iran. Since his retirement from frontline diplomacy, Sir Richard has been a frequent commentator on Iran and its foreign relations, and I'm delighted to now hand over to him to open the panel today.
Thank you very much, Charlie. There's 2 topics that I hope all participants will come away from this seminar understanding better. The first is what's going on now, and the second, although forecasting the future is almost impossible, so many imponderables, I hope that you will go away with an idea of what may happen in the near term and the medium term. So forecasting is a mug's game, but with such an important country, we've got to try. Our 3 speakers, I'm not going to introduce them because you've got it all down on paper as to who they are and what they have done. But Ali will open and will cover the state of the power structure in Iran. He'll think about the present juncture and the historic development of the Islamic Republic, including Khamenei's influence on the country. Then Holly will take over on the Iranian economy, say more about domestic politics and the security or insecurity, as she sees it, of the ruling system. And then Dr. Banafsheh will think about the regional picture, Iran's relations with its neighbors and the wider world, and how the nuclear issue and confrontation with US and Israel is playing out. So roughly 6 minutes for each, and then 25 minutes Q&A, and then a final session in which I'll ask each of them to give us a few minutes on how they see the future, how the scenarios that one can imagine could be weighted as to more or less likely. So, Ali, could I ask you to start?
Thank you very much, Richard. I highlight a few points in terms of what I think the situation is domestically at the moment in terms of the regime and how it's operating. I think a colleague of mine said, and I think this is a very apposite description, is that the regime has come out of the 12-day war with Israel with a sort of a severe concussion, and it's not entirely clear what its response should be. I think we've seen some of the paucity in a sense of its thinking in terms of how it handled snapback, and it's been really caught a little bit wrong-footed, really, by the fact that the Europeans did indeed pursue the snapback option, and of course now they're arguing that actually, the whole situation had been fiddled or is illegal or whatever. But the fact is, the situation that the regime finds itself in is one in which it's suffered a fairly severe setback. It sought to shore up its domestic constituency really by heavily, I have to say, turning up the volume to 11 in terms of its nationalist rhetoric and propaganda. I don't think I've ever seen so many pre-Islamic monarchs dragooned and drafted into service of the Islamic Republic as we have seen in the last 3 months. And it just goes on and on. And recently we saw the most extraordinary and I think rather nice statue of Rostam being sort of opened up. I think it was in, if I'm not mistaken, in Isfahan. It's, these are things where they're trying to utilize, I suppose, a degree of sort of a sentiment towards sort of national sentiment as opposed to Islamic sentiment towards the country. And in some ways that sort of is a reflection, I would say, of the bankruptcy of the regime itself, that it hasn't been able really to pull together people on the basis of its standard sort of martyrology or its sort of concept of Islamism. So this, to my mind, is quite interesting, and it reflects the fact that a lot of people, I think, are very, very critical of what Khamenei has done and the direction of travel in which he's taken the country. His entire grand strategy, in a way, has unraveled over the last 18 months. And his response to this has really been to double down, in a sense, on the old ideology, and to say everything will work out in the end, and the people of Syria will eventually realize the error of their ways, and so on and so forth. But also to claim that really they scored a major victory against the Israelis in the 12-day war. I think a lot of that is really the result of a sort of a sense of relief, actually, that the American intervention didn't go on for any longer, and actually that the conflict did end, and obviously they feel that they survived. But I don't think domestically you see that many people actually believe that the regime did well out of the war. It certainly didn't collapse. I think that some of that was really a hostage to fortune that both Trump and Netanyahu had waffled on about regime change and things like that, which I don't think was particularly helpful. But it didn't do particularly well either. It lost control of its airspace within 72 hours. And most critically, well, in two ways. One is it didn't provide actually the sort of defenses for its, civil defenses for its population that people might have expected. Even basic things like air raid sirens and stuff were sort of missing, but shelters and other things that I think people were a bit wary of. And the other thing, of course, is the intelligence penetration that took place. I mean, the fact that the Israeli attack was so devastating, certainly in the first few days, was because the Israelis had managed one way or another to penetrate the security and intelligence establishment of the Islamic Republic. And of course, people were saying then that, this showed the deep, deep corruption that had infected the system. And I think this is perhaps the underlying theme that really shapes our understanding of the Islamic Republic today. Many of the structural problems that the country faced before the war are structural problems that persist after the conflict. And I think the best way to look at Iran at the moment is to look at it not in terms of regime change, but in terms of regime transition. That something is clear, what the 12-day war has lit in that sense is a very long fuse. And you're seeing, things sort of changing, not necessarily imperceptibly, it has to say. If you look at women's veiling, for instance, I'm sure others will be able to comment on this more than me, but it's really quite striking how the whole hijab rules have been largely discarded now, because people are saying that they don't want to risk another uprising of people and they don't want to risk any more turmoil. I mean, that is quite a striking admission by many people within the regime that this is the situation. So I think there is this sort of element, and we'll talk about it obviously later, I think, in terms of, not as a historian, though, I think as one philosopher said, that historians don't predict, but they can prophesy. So I might engage in a bit of prophesying later on. But the fact is that what you're seeing really is a process of, I think, transition. Some of it is subtle, no doubt about it, but others will be more explicit. And I think everyone's now waiting for that moment when Khamenei will eventually give up the ghost and what the succession planning will be. But I think some of the arguments that even I held before last year about how the succession would go, I think now have to be reviewed and reassessed, because I don't think Khamenei's position is strong. I don't think the IRGC's position is strong, actually. I don't think the IRGC has come out of this struggle in a very emphatic or a positive way. We have to look behind the bravado. I mean, the bravado at the moment is quite striking. And one of the things, I'll just finish with this, one of the things that I've been very struck by is a lot of the sort of regime sort of social media platforms are all talking about the round two of the conflict, is about to happen, and that the Israelis are about to attack again. I mean, it's like they're saying to everyone, we need to keep everyone on a war footing, because actually this works if we can keep solidarity. I'm not sure this is actually credible at all. I mean, as I said to someone said to me, do you think there'll be another round? And I said, no. And he said, why do you think so? I said, because I don't think anyone thinks it's necessary. And of course, that sort of disappointed him a little bit. But I mean, the point was, what I was saying was that actually, the country is in enough of a problem as it is, economically and environmentally in particular, that, leave well alone. I mean, it's decaying of its own accord. So the question is the speed, and I'm happy to discuss, how that will happen. I think there's all sorts of black swan events that may occur, of course, which may accelerate it. But at the moment, what we have in Iran is a whole raft of people knowing exactly what the problem is, but nobody really having any idea what to do about it. And while some people may say that these sort of arguments are very familiar to those of us in the West, the fact is, I would say that Iran's problems are qualitatively of a different nature, or the Islamic Republic's problems. And let's be very specific that I'm talking about the regime here, not necessarily the wider country or the wider people, which is a separate thing, actually. And I mean, I think that distinction has to be retained. I'll stop there. I hope that's 6 minutes, Richard, and I don't think I've had any red flags or anything come up, so that's good. And I will pass on the baton.
Okay, exemplary. Thank you very much. Holly, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me today. It's a hard act to follow, but I'll try. So, in terms of the Iranian economy, a lot is happening amongst the people. Of course, we just mentioned the snapback sanctions that were reimposed at the end of September. For those that are not familiar, the snapback actually, the UN sanctions include asset freezes, conventional arms embargo, restrictions on ballistic missile activities, and travel bans on Iranian officials. So you might be thinking, okay, how would this impact an ordinary Iranian? But actually, the moment that the talk of snapback might be coming back was impacting the rial, and obsessively, I would say since the war and during the war, Iranians had been looking at the rial and US dollar conversion rate, and as well as the how much gold has been going up and down. And so at this juncture, the rial is averaging at over 100,000 or toman, 100,000 toman per the US dollar. Today, I just checked, it was 108,000. And just to give you a sense of where things are at, when I moved to Iran in 1999, it was 800. So this is where we're at, this big jump. But, when you look at the days of when the nuclear deal had happened, the average Iranian was blaming US sanctions or Western sanctions in general as the root of their problems. But today, when you talk to the average Iranian, they see that the root of their problems is systemic mismanagement and corruption, and sanctions being not the top issue. And I'll highlight this just from some of the commentary when snapback was happening. The Free Union of Iranian Workers had put out a statement, and they said, "We, the workers, retirees, wage earners, and oppressed layers of society know you very well and will not allow you to deceive us with excuses like war, sanctions, and the very inflations you yourselves have created." And there were retiree protests, and one of the chants was, "Enough warmongering, our tables are empty, and our enemy is right here. They lie and they say it's America." So I think you can really get a sense on the ground that there's this recognition that the Islamic Republic and its decision-making is the root cause of their problems. In terms of domestic politics, there's major conversations happening very publicly about the future of Iran. We've seen a lot of prominent activists, including Green Movement leader Mir Hossein Mousavi, call for a referendum while being under house arrest. We've seen Nobel laureate Narges Mohammadi sign an open statement with 17 others calling for the same thing, and in essence arguing that this is a regime that's not reformable. And we've also been seeing the regime itself having interesting, I would say, blasts from the past coming out of the woodwork. We've seen Ali Larijani, the former Speaker of Parliament, take the role of Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, and former President Hassan Rouhani, whose claim to fame arguably was the 2015 nuclear deal and has had to pay heavily, big price domestically, has also come out of the woodwork and is very publicly talking about the need for reform and making concessions and talks with the United States to not just prevent war, but also just for the survival of the regime itself. Some of you might have seen the viral video of Ali Shamkhani's daughter's wedding, and I've seen it at this point. It's been in Arabic media, New York Times, but there was also some backstory to it, apparently, that it was tied to this infighting between the Shamkhani camp and the Rouhani camp. And apparently Shamkhani had recently put the blame on Rouhani for the PS-752 Ukrainian airliner, saying that he knew all along that the IRGC was behind the shoot down. And so this apparently was a response, this leaking of this video that's about a year old now. So I think there's a lot of
Sorry, what was the significance of the video?
The video was that it was a private wedding. His daughter was wearing very revealing clothes, and it was at a very high-end hotel, and it very much showed a different Iran than what we're expecting from the top leadership. And so the leaking of this video angered many Iranians, and it did exactly the job it was intended to do. But I think the key here is that Rouhani is actually vying for the turban of supreme leader. And I think this is meant to actually be this indirect fighting that we're seeing play out publicly is actually meaning to tarnish his reputation with the commentary from Shamkhani. So these are some of the events that are happening behind the scenes and that are playing out on social media, arguably. Dr. Ansari talked about the intelligence issue on the ground. I've been saying that the Mossad has been treating Iran like a playground for years now, but that really came to head during the 12-day war with what they did on the ground. I think it's noteworthy that we have not seen the supreme leader much publicly. He did give a speech earlier this week, but I think there's a real worry that he could be assassinated like Hassan Nasrallah. We also see that Ismail Ghani, the IRGC Quds Force commander, is also in the same boat. There was a rumor circulating last week that he might have been assassinated and it was interesting to see IRGC affiliated Fars News come out and quickly say, no, this rumor is false. And Ismail Ghani actually said in an interview that he thinks what's happening here is that the Israelis are hoping that his friends will get worried and contact him, and that's how they'll be able to geolocate him and actually kill him. So I think that was the explanation for why Fars News was quickly able to quiet the rumors. There's also been rumors since the 12-day war of the Israelis continuing to take operations within Iran. There's been these suspicious gas leaks that are happening. One of my colleagues here at the Washington Institute said that, when we talk about ceasefire, the Iranians have ceased, but it doesn't necessarily mean the Israelis have stopped firing. So I think that that's also noteworthy. And Dr. Ansari also noted that average Iranian actually thinks that another war is imminent, whether it's an armchair Iranian uncle in Tehran to members of the clerical establishment. It's not a question of if, but when. And the regime itself has actually been preparing very much for it. They've had their soldiers sign wills, they've handed out dog tags, they're doing military drills. They've reconstituted the National Defense Council, which hasn't been around since the bloody war with Iraq in the 1980s. So you're seeing this real sense of, okay, we need to prepare for the worst. And the average Iranian is also thinking this as well. The ones that are able to afford it, they're buying properties outside of Tehran so they have somewhere to flee. Iranians in Tehran are making sure their gas tanks aren't empty so they don't have to stand in hour-long lines like they did during the war. So there's a real sense of worry, but also a sense of wonder about what does this mean, and that the Islamic Republic does this mean its end because of the events since post-October 7th? And I noticed, like, in recent weeks, we keep seeing memes and videos of the Titanic being shared on social media. And in essence, people are insinuating that the Islamic Republic is sinking ships. So they're tying that this eventual war being part of that.
Thank you very much indeed on that very somber note for the Nizam. So, Dr. Banafsheh, how do you see it?
I'd like to first start by thanking the Royal Society for Asian Affairs and you, Sir Richard, and my co-panelists for being together today and for the opportunity to speak. Now, you've asked me to talk about Iran's relations in the region and the wider world and the issue of, the nuclear program and its confrontation with the US and Israel and how that might play out. If I may, I'd like to talk about some structural and systemic factors that will and have been influencing Iran. Iran is acting as a middle power, as we know, within the region of the Middle East to ensure connectivity. And that can mean different things for different regional countries in terms of their ties with Tehran. But suffice to say that more and more countries in the region are aiming to restore a level of organic balance of power with Iran in order to keep the regional peace. Although weak regional multilateralism would mean that that effort might break down in the event of another war in which Iran would be increasingly isolated. But that said, for Iran, what this means is sustaining regime stability, and that's a systemic factor, through shared regional interests. And this is why, for example, President Pezeshkian's government is insisting on, building bilateral and multilateral regional relations in order to kind of ward off the pressures of war with the US and Israel. But globally, at a more structural level, Iran's middle power status aims to alter the positionality of the world powers in a manner that the world powers, including the UK and the US, would accommodate Iran more and more increasingly, if not willingly, but by force if they have to, because they simply see no other alternative, and or B, that the world powers fail to impose their dominant concept of order on Iran. In other words, a lack of order, in my humble opinion, is preferable for Iran compared to an imposed order, especially if it means a Western-dominated order. Now, why is that the case? Because Iran's middle power status is able to shift regional and international calculations at some level in a manner that serves Tehran. On a more concrete level, let's take the example of how this plays out with regard to Iran's nuclear program and the perils of dealing with it after the US-Israel war on Iran of June 2025. The war triggered debates on the merits of developing a weapons-grade program, and more so mindful of Israel's expanding military operations across the Middle East against numerous other countries and that were especially those allies of Iran. In response, Iran opted to maintain a fluid nuclear regime, which is what I have termed as meaning one that lacks easily enforceable non-proliferation parameters. This is despite 5 rounds of nuclear talks with the US and Washington urging for post-war diplomatic solutions, as well as the UK, France, and Germany, as we know. At the regional level, this enabled Iran as a middle power again to instill the need that other regional countries had to be mindful of Iran's potential weaponization program and therefore accommodate it. And we know that, for example, Qatar, along with possibly other Arab Gulf countries, not to mention, the Pakistani-Saudi axis, tried to, in this period, to ensure that the war would not destabilize the region completely if it were to trigger a massive Iranian counterattack or war. Globally, Iran's fluid nuclear regime aimed to pressure the US that it could not easily dismantle the regime in Tehran. So to sum up, Tehran developed a counter-hegemonic nuclear narrative to impact both the region and US calculations by maintaining this fluid nuclear regime, which it will continue to do as it grants more guarantees of protection for the regime, which Tehran calculated was worth risking, even if a second war broke out with Israel and the US. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we'll start some questions. The first one is directed to Ali, and the questioner wants to take you up, Ali, on your suggestion that the IRGC is weak or weaker. It has managed so far to resist all attempts to get it under the authority of the tax regime, for example. So how do you see that it is weak?
So my main point is really, I'm saying it's weaker rather than weak. I mean, I think there's a distinction there. I'm not saying they're necessarily, and I think institutionally they obviously rake in money and that's fine. But I'm talking really about their political legitimacy with the wider public. So they spend a huge amount of effort really trying to say that they are the guarantors and the defenders of the revolution, as the Revolutionary Guards should be. But I think, the last 4 or 5 years, particularly through COVID, when they invented their own sort of COVID detection radar gun, this sort of thing, which they were very upbeat about. I mean, I think people are beginning to see them as a little bit of a sort of a, very repressive tool, but not exactly something that is, garners the sort of respect that I think they deserve. They think they deserve. So if you were to, and there were recently major arguments between the military, the regular military, and the IRGC about who performed, more helpfully during the war, the Iran-Iraq war I'm talking about. So it's this sort of thing that, even the regular military are getting very frustrated by the way in which the IRGC are appropriating sort of almost all the credit they could possibly get for the Iran-Iraq war. But this recent conflict with Israel, you see, of course, is that you've got to compare the bombast with which they started out, basically saying last year, there's absolutely no chance, they said, that the Israelis would be able to attack. And, we're so powerful, we've produced all our own kit, this sort of thing, and our air defenses are impenetrable and so on and so forth, with the reality of what happened. So my argument really there is just simply to say that the IRGC, to my mind, are no longer, been a while now, but certainly no longer have that sort of legitimacy with the wider public that they might have aspired to earlier. And actually people are looking more and more towards the regular military as a sort of a bastion of, in a sense, nationalist ideology.
Thank you. The next question we've got is about the nuclear capability and the nuclear policy. I'll leave it open, perhaps, who'd like to comment on this, but I'll start with Dr. Banafsheh. Do you believe that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons capability, or have they decided that the risks of doing that are far too high because they're so penetrated that everybody would know that they were doing that if they should switch into developing nuclear weapons?
I've always believed that Iran has wanted to develop the know-how for nuclear weaponization, potential nuclear weaponization. And that was confirmed to me in discussions with a former advisor to the Supreme Leader's office in 2008, who told me in confidence back then, and I've now published about it, now that it's kind of water under the bridge, and others have said it, that his office decided that the know-how was essential. Now, does that necessarily mean Iran will weaponize? One of the factors that has prevented Iran from weaponization is its Shia belief system, in that almost 99.9% of the Shia clerics in Iran, and many of whom I've interviewed, have basically issued rulings that the use of weapons of mass destruction goes against Sharia law. And they cite, the Hadith and Islamic history and the wars led by the Prophet Muhammad, during which he basically banned, for example, the poisoning of water and water wells that would potentially kill on a mass scale the enemies, citing that mass killing is just basically not okay. And so 99.9%, rejection of the use of WMDs creates a major impediment for Tehran to immediately decide to weaponize. But having said that, Iran makes these decisions on elite-based consensus building processes. Why is this necessary? Because this is a religiously indoctrinated state system, as you know quite well, Sir Richard, from your firsthand experiences serving in Iran. And we tend to dismiss that in the West and really not sufficiently appreciate what that means to the Iranian elite. That consensus building process requires first and foremost that Tehran, Iran's leaders gauge the domestic pulse in terms of domestic stability. And if they feel that that domestic pulse is acting against them, then they must first ensure domestic stability. And the nuclear narrative then feeds into it, depending on which direction Iran's negotiations with the Western powers go. So to sum up, in order for us to understand if this kind of rather inward-looking regime is more likely to weaponize or not, will depend on how Iran measures the pulse domestically and then in response to foreign pressures.
Thank you. I think that's right. My own view is that their policy at present is to fend off international pressures while not moving to having a nuclear weapon. I think their long-term strategy that weaponization would make them more vulnerable rather than more invulnerable still holds true. This has been declared on innumerable occasions by countless strategists and theorizers of the Iranian situation. So I think that more secular interpretation of their situation is reinforcing the religious reservations. And of course, as I hinted in where I presented the question, I don't think now they could be at all confident that they could sneak out, that they could develop a weapons program and divert highly enriched uranium for the purpose of forming the core of an explosive device without being detected very quickly. So prudence, as well as ideology, dictates, as far as I'm concerned, that they will continue to strive for threshold status, for resuming the search for all the different technologies when the time is right, but they are not going to weaponize. And they still hope that continuing to develop their enrichment program, once that's possible once more, will be a point of leverage for the eventual discussions which they know they've got to have to improve their domestic economic situation by getting some form of new agreement with the international community many years down the line. And my next question is for Holly. And I'd like your views on the thoughts of Middle Eastern rivals such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and the UAE. How are they going to exploit Iran's perceived or actual reduction in power and influence in the region?
I think there's been an interesting turn of events, I would say, since the 2019 Aramco attacks in Saudi Arabia. At that time, Saudi Arabia and Iran ceased to have relations after the storming of the Saudi consulates in Tehran and Mashhad. And there was a real backing from Arab countries in the Persian Gulf of max pressure at the time, which was led by the first Trump administration. But there was a real reality check after Aramco that these countries could not rely on the United States as a security guarantor. And so they realized that they need to start talking to Tehran and they need to start solving their own problems. And it wasn't just Saudi Arabia, it was the Emirates. And some of this was also driven by the oil embargo at the time and the attacks and the seizures of oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. And I remember famously Kayhan newspaper threatening the Emirates with a ballistic missile flying overhead. So a lot of that really pushed everyone to the table to start talking. And we saw the relations continue again between the two countries in a China brokered deal starting in 2023. And now with these big vision projects in the region, there's a real concern about stability in the region. And the surprise attack on Qatar in June and then the Israeli attack on Qatar with the Hamas leadership was also a reminder, okay, we need this stability. We need to make sure that there's not another conflict that impacts our country's economies. And so they're very much in the business of stability right at this juncture. So they are trying to, I would say, stabilize the region in various ways, backing this Gaza deal. I think for them, they see that another conflict between Iran and Israel is not helpful at all. And so we're really seeing this complete 180 since 2019 between ties. And I think that you're going to be continuing to see them doing more back channeling to make sure that another conflict doesn't pop off in the region that impacts their trade and economies and their future projects for their respective countries.
Thank you very much. Ali, the question for you is about the possibility of further conflict between Israel and Iran. To stay on that theme, what do you think the reaction of Iran's nominal allies, China and Russia, would be? And the questioner suggests that given that many sources speculate that Russia and China have been supporting Iran economically and militarily, and they themselves are subject to Western sanctions, would it actually be in the interests of Russia and China for the current Iranian government in its current form to survive?
I think as far as Russia is concerned, that's certainly true. And actually one of the more entertaining debates going on at the moment, as Holly was discussing the sort of the conflict between Rouhani and Shamkhani, you actually now have a fairly sort of violent punch-up going on between Zarif and Lavrov about whether the Russians have deliberately sought to sabotage the JCPOA talks and all the other sort of attempts by the Islamic Republic to establish a sort of a détente with the West, that the Russians are not keen on that. And I think there is a pattern there, of course, that the Russians are not obviously going to be over enthusiastic about an idea in which Iran is reconnected to the West in some way or form, even if it's not, if it clearly remains non-aligned, which it's likely to be so, but the fact that it would sort of be open for business, shall we say, to the West. So I think that there is an interest there. In terms of support, I have to say, and I mean, I think there's the two things here. I think the Chinese are much more pragmatic in their relationships with Iran. I don't think they're going to risk really anything vis-a-vis, the United States or others, or their other interests in terms of standing up for Iran. Yes, I don't think they want to see, but I don't think this is actually in anyone in the West's interests either, to see Iran sort of like completely dissolve or collapse or in a heap or this, that, or the other. So they will probably take measures to try and prevent that. But neither Russia or China has actually been terribly helpful, despite the speculation. When you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find that even the economic arrangements, I think China signed this great sort of memorandum of understanding for what the Iranians said was $400 billion worth of investment. I think the total amount of Chinese investment exchange may amount to about $150 million. I don't know, it's not a huge amount. China has much, much bigger interests with Saudi Arabia, for instance, and it's not going to jeopardize those. The Russians, on the other hand, have much tighter relations, particularly with the IRGC and the sort of political leadership, but they've been found wanting. I mean, they obviously have their own preoccupations with Ukraine, and they're not particularly, I don't think they really have the sort of flexibility or the capacity really to share a lot with Iran at the moment. But actually, they're, apart from sort of rhetorical or diplomatic heft, which obviously does have its uses in the Security Council and other places, in terms of practical support, it's been pretty negligible. And I think Iranians have noticed this. There's little love lost, I have to say, between the wider Iranian public and Russia anyway. This is really an elite sort of relationship. But the fact is they sort of noticed, and there was a memorable exchange with a journalist, I think, to the foreign ministry, I think in the aftermath of the, it might have been the aftermath of 12-day war, it might have actually just been after the two sort of missile exchanges. And they sort of said that, in fact, I think it was after the October missile exchange, where they said that, you know, you've got to give the Americans their due. They stick by their allies. And by this, he meant Israel. But where are the Russians? You know, where are the Russians? Why have they not supported us? Where is the, you know, the extra the S-400s? Where are the jets and others that they promised? And you know, of course, they haven't materialized. The other thing I have to say that when we talk about this sort of relationship between China, Russia, and Iran and military help, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact, of course, that the Iranians also have this sort of false assumption that, you know, by the click of a finger, you know, they can sort things out. But let's say, for the sake of argument, they buy in all this high-tech Chinese equipment in particular, because after the Pakistan-India conflagration, I think there's been a lot of talk about this sort of Chinese fifth grade, you know, fighters, fifth generation, I should say. The fact is, this would take time to integrate. I mean, this is the point. It's not a question of simply buying this equipment in and it's suddenly all being operated. The fact is, you have to train the pilots, you have to integrate the systems, you have to be sure that the Chinese are going to help in terms of radar and other sort of AWACS systems. And of course, you know, none of this is really been thought about. And again, it reflects a little bit of the short-termism, which I think we've all encountered in Iran, that they sort of have this sort of rather sort of naive assumption that everything can be resolved in no time at all. A lot of these things need much longer planning. So I don't see the Chinese and the Russians certainly coming to Iran's aid in a meaningful sense, other than diplomatic, perhaps rhetorical, and in that sense, the Russians more than the Chinese. I think the Chinese are very, very circumspect, and even their sort of attempt to broker a peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, you know, I think their interests really there are to maintain the flow of oil out. I mean, they're not, and the Saudis deliver that much more than the Iranians.
Right, thank you. Now, one question about internal affairs, and then a final one about the possibility of war, and then we'll end the questions and turn to the summaries. The question about internal affairs for Dr. Banafsheh is in two parts. First, briefly, what role does the clerical establishment and religious legitimacy play today in maintaining internal stability? In other words, are there enough people who really care about the mission of the Islamic Republic as laid down by Ayatollah Khomeini to bring to bear, you know, forces that contribute to stability, or are they now so outflanked by the majority that wants to see change that religion is pretty irrelevant? And the second question is this wonderful one that somehow things might turn out without disorder in Iran. And is there a glasnost or perestroika type scenario in which the Islamic Republic sees the writing on the wall and decides to liberalize to a point at which it might be able to survive, or there's a smooth succession to something different? So it's two questions for you.
May I just say how pleased I am, how grateful I am to receive these two fascinating questions, and thank you very much for raising them. The religious establishment is concerned that it might be losing momentum, especially after the June war, and increased questioning by the population about, well, what is Iran doing with Hamas, you know, etc. But that said, I don't think that we can readily dismiss the religious establishment at all, because we're speaking about a country that's, you know, by some accounts, 85 million, and out of these 85 million people, an increasing trend towards secularization has emerged. But that said, the religious establishment might still possess considerable influence in terms of mobilizing at least 20-25% of that population. And we also know that the religious And let's not forget that Iran has a huge army. Along with its shadow army, we're talking about possibly 4 million, but we don't really have an exact count of that. These are recruits that go through serious training and a level of indoctrination. Let's put that aside. If you look at how the politicians in Iran interact with the religious establishment, that's also quite fascinating. In times of national crisis, they rush to Qom and to the seminaries, and they meet with the senior clerics to exchange professional and at some level personal information about where the country should move in the face of a war or a national crisis. So at all times, the endorsement of this religious establishment is necessary for Tehran. Now, the supreme leader sits at the helm of this religious establishment, and I've done a lot of field work in Qom and Mashhad, so I do know that they defer critical decisions to the leadership, without doubt. But that does not make the leadership per se immune from the opinions of the religious establishment. And the case example of whether Iran should weaponize on the nuclear front or not, which I raise, is just one example of how that connection moves forward. You also
But is it just state enforcement that counts now, or is there a compelling element in that 25% of the population that they really would sacrifice their lives and spring to the defense of the regime?
There is a compelling narrative beyond the state because the clerics have grassroots presence all over Iran. That's what led to the successful mobilization during the revolution. Now we're about 45 years away from that period of time, and they've lost a lot of momentum, but we're still not gauging how their influence at grassroots levels, at less urban settings, at more impoverished settings is. And until we have a clear assessment of that, we cannot readily dismiss that influence at all, in my very humble opinion, Sir Richard. You asked also about whether Iran might see a period of glasnost or perestroika. I want to take a step back, if I may, and just say that following the June War, the Marja'iyat, the establishment of the Jury Council of Shia clerics came together and said, we need to do something. We are in a crisis. And if we don't do something, Shia Islam will lose its validity, not only inside Iran, but then it risks impacting the Shia influence across the Middle East and all over the world. And Shia influence is very important because what this is not about Iran. This is about Islam as far as they're concerned. So there's a transnational element to the need to retain the influence of the clerics as well. And so they suggested that we need to engage with the leadership in Tehran about how to improve governance. So A, the people of Iran continue to turn to us for help, and B, that Shia Islam, above all, that is their mission, must not lose its validity transnationally, because ultimately, Shia Islam is supposed to cross borders and boundaries. Now, that feeds into the question of glasnost and perestroika, because glasnost and perestroika, Sir Richard, you would know much better than me, in the Soviet era, basically the Soviet Union and Russia started looking inward, and those republics fell apart because they realized that the preservation of the Russian motherland required, at that moment of time, possibly under Gorbachev, a perestroika. In Iran, we're talking about quite the opposite. We're talking about a transnational influence for Iran. The survival of Iran is necessary in order to feed the sheer transnational influence. So that moment of perestroika and glasnost would not come to Iran and dawn on Iran in a natural manner. It would be prudent and expedient if they felt to embark on that moment to preserve the regime, to ensure regime survival. And they might make me or you or Holly or Ali a president if that was prudent enough. But they don't care about that. It's important to preserve the national wealth and foundation in order to preserve the transnational. And so I And hence, you know, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the leaders, has been trained to emerge as a new sort of MBS. They like to say, they like to make that comparison for the for the future of Iran. But that said, I don't think I myself cannot fool myself for a moment into thinking that the very nature of this regime would transform drastically. It would take on different manifestations that may look like a moment of change, but the foundational basis of Iran under the Islamic Republic remains intact in terms of the influence of the Marja'iyat on leading the state. I hope this kind of answers some part of the question.
It does. Righty-ho, let's turn to the second quite short part and the final part of our seminar, namely, how is Iran going to look in a few years' time? And I'm going to start with you, Holly. So you have the first stab at your suggestion for the most likely scenarios for Iran's development.
Well, here in Washington, I've been saying this a lot, which is that we're in the post-October 7th world where nothing makes sense and anything's possible. And looking at the events in Syria, I really firmly believe that anything is really possible with Iran. Having that been said, I don't see regime collapse at this juncture. I certainly didn't see the signs of it during the war. Dr. Ansari actually described it a while back that we were on a panel together as long-term regime erosion is where we're at. And I think that calculation could obviously change if another war happens with Israel. What I can say with confidence is that the IRGC controls 30% of the Iranian economy and it has the guns, so they will be very keen to preserve their own interests. It also wouldn't surprise me if someone from the IRGC puts on a suit, wraps himself in the flag of Iranian nationalism, declares long live Iran as the mantra instead of death to Israel and death to the United States. But at this juncture, it seems that the clerical establishment is inflexible to change for reasons that I understand because of their worldview, and given their history. But you know, that very inflexibility might affect its ability, will affect its ability to survive because their old playbook is not working in the post-October 7th era, and that could very well bring on their own demise.
But how?
I mean, you're asking me to look into a crystal ball.
Yes, please.
How? I mean, I think that the country is really up for grabs. I mean, another war could set things off. There could be real decision making on the ground that would invariably change the Islamic Republic. The death of Khamenei, whether by air or old age, could also set those events in motion. But I defer to everyone to read Karim Sajapour's recent piece in Foreign Affairs. I think it really plays it out well, various scenarios, North Korea as an example, Turkey, Russia. And so I think if anybody was to say with confidence beyond just the basics that I just noted, that they know for sure what's going to happen, I wouldn't trust it because anything's really possible at this juncture.
Thank you. Ali. Unmute.
I am now, yeah. So the one thing I will say, just to sort of shake it up a little bit, is I don't think the status quo is an option, and I'll tell you why. And the reason I don't think the status quo is an option is because the state is not delivering, and it's gradually, you know, delivering less and less. It's having problem delivering its main utilities, water, electricity, gas. Yes, it's got a certain amount of patronage left, obviously, in order to provide a certain amount of economic support, but even that is running out. I mean, it's got this. We have this sort of bizarre situation that, you know, Iran is not a poor country, but its government is in a state of crisis, an economic crisis. And I mean, you know, don't take my word for it. Look at, you know, almost every economist in Iran is bitterly complaining about the way things have been run and things have been run down. So sooner or later, that will push. I mean, something will have to give. I mean, you simply cannot go on like this. And I think, actually going back to Holly's point, I think that's absolutely right, that, you know, the sheer inflexibility of some of the dogmatism going on at the higher levels will actually make the situation more brittle. If they showed a bit of flexibility, you know, I think a lot of us would like to see, you know, we always have these sort of rational sort of arguments about how they will modify and adapt and move. And, you know, in the past, I think they've shown a quite an extraordinary ability to do that. But at the moment, I think they are losing their grip. And I think they're losing their grip on the population as well. To go back to Banafsheh's point, I think it's absolutely right that you could say 20% or 30% will have a certain religious attachment. But I think there's also a distinction to be made by those who consider themselves to be very devout Muslims, who don't see the Islamic Republic as particularly devout. I mean, you know, who have sort of have separated themselves from that. And I think that, you know, spirituality being what it is in Iran, I think people are finding their sources of spirituality in different ways. I mean, I think that's clearly taking place. Now, some of those will be slower, some of those will be quicker. And, you know, as Holly and Banafsheh have said in the way, you know, you could have, you know, black swan events. Let's not get into that. We can't predict those, but, you know, it's very possible that certain things may happen that will actually speed up or accelerate the crisis. And the way things happen, I mean, the way I've said, and I've said this before, is I think, you know, we are very much in a sort of a 1919, 1920 model, you know, where you see a group of people coming up and saying, you know, we can't go on like this. We need a government of national unity. And as you bring up this sort of idea of a government of national unity, combined with, you know, various contributions from various state organizations, it can include people from within the system and people without the system. But ultimately, they will begin to make that inexorable shift away. You know, Khamenei and the, you know, obviously I think one of the things we can all know is that he will die sooner or later. So, I mean, that's one change that is going to happen. You know, what happens when he goes? I mean, will there be a new leader, or will they try and go for a leadership council, for instance? It's in the constitution. They could do it. But again, you know, these are options ahead of them. I think the more flexibility they show, the longer the system will survive. The less flexibility they'll show, the more likely that the head of steam will build up, that you'll see something more dramatic. And these are the, you know, if you go on the spectrum, the range of effects that can happen. I'm sorry to say, and I regret to say in some ways, I have to agree with Holly on this, that not that I regret agreeing with Holly, I regret that her analysis is probably right, that they don't have the flexibility. And because they don't have the flexibility, the likely critical tipping point, in a sense, the crash that will happen will be even more severe than it should have been. But it's, you know, it's a matter of time. Iranians are extremely stoic people, you know, Richard, as we know. I mean, they put up with a lot of pain.
I've got to leave a minute or two.
But I'll leave it there.
Dr. Banafsheh, but yeah, I won't forget that. So the crash, when it happens, will be a more severe one. Banafsheh, what do you think?
So Iran maintains, as I said, a fluid nuclear regime through elite consensus, which is necessary for regime stability. That's established in my humble view. And by gauging the public pulse, as I said, to ensure domestic security first and foremost, in order to then ensure regime survival in nuclear dealings with the Western powers. Now, however, that said, Iran's consensus-based politics veers toward catastrophe by overestimating the country's power and resources. And we saw that happen in June 2025, because just a day before the war broke out, Iran's foreign minister was like predicting that he has time to consider a new Washington proposal for a nuclear deal. And then lo and behold, the next day the war broke out. You know, as a result, Tehran will continue to suffer from internal differences of perception about how to move the nuclear program forward because of this catastrophe. And I can say more about it, of course, but, you know, ironically, this also gives Tehran more resilience in exploring possibilities than one would imagine readily. And this is why Iran insists on retaining enrichment capacity for deterrence, possibly, as well as for future bargaining potentially at the same time, thereby challenging an international security system reinforced by the US. So to understand this better, we need to kind of go back to sort of the staggered talks between Iran with Europe and the West. They continue to buy Iran time to decide about weaponization, while war may also trigger it, of course. Now, Iran's difficult dealings with two Trump administrations cannot be ignored. It reinforces its desire to maintain both options that is potential weaponization for deterrent purposes or a strong nuclear program for deterrent purposes, as well as for bargaining at the same time, and to buy time until a post-Trump scenario emerges. The path forward will therefore mean that Iran will remain somewhat uncompromising, especially if the trajectory of US-Iran ties is shaped by Washington encouraging power imbalances between Israel and Iran, which inherently undermines negotiations. Ultimately, Iran's nuclear policy is not driven by pure cost-benefit calculations, a point necessary for us to recognize, but by elite unity again, that is built through consistent ideological and religious indoctrination of needing to contain American hegemony. And the nuclear program is intended to consolidate the regime's power. As a result, this communal, what I call hayati, a religious establishment mindset that dominates elite nuclear policy decision-making processes, and in which the army and the Revolutionary Guards also, dictate the doctrine, will not easily surrender. And basically what that means is that the trajectory of future negotiations will remain conflictual unless Washington is willing to yield and give Iran some homeland security guarantees, which is unclear if that will happen, mindful of the polarized relations between Israel and Iran. Thank you.
I think that's right. Very final word from me. I don't think we're going to see negotiations between the United States and Iran anytime soon. Iran will remain concentrating on reconstruction where it can and re-strengthening its military capabilities. It's not going to be in a hurry to move to any sort of concession given the way it's been treated. And the same is true on the other side. The Europeans have painted themselves out of the picture. They are no longer a trusted interlocutor for Iran, having more or less aped the American position all along in the last year. And the United States is simply waiting to see what the effect of its renewed sanctions and Israeli attacks will be. So it's a poor lookout for any international intervention to try and bring more certainty to the region and promote the chances of stability. I shall leave it at that. Thank you very much, all three speakers, for wonderful insights, complemented each other beautifully. And I'll hand back to you, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for your moderating and keeping everyone strictly to time, which has worked out very well. And yes, thank you again to all the speakers. It was a really interesting discussion on a very complex topic that I'm sure many capitals will be keeping a very close eye on over the coming months and years. Going on with the theme of Trump, our next event is a 2-day online conference on Trump's policy towards the various regions of Asia in his second term. So if anybody is interested in that, it's on the 6th and 7th of November. All the details are on our website and you can book your places there. But again, thank you to everyone.